Good afternoon and welcome to our regular BSI IFE webinar series, where today we'll be exploring the role of evacuation lifts in the built environment. For those of us that haven't met before, my name is Ant Bird and I'm head of the built environment sector here within BSI Standards, and it's my pleasure to be your host for today's session. Firstly, however, before I introduce you to a great lineup of speakers, I have some housekeeping to do. Those of you that have joined us before, you'll know this, so forgive me, but this is a listen-only webinar, but it is being recorded, okay? We really do welcome your questions, however, via the Q&A function. And we've listened to you, I promise. We've got two great speakers today, but we've made sure that we have ample time at the end to take your questions, and I'm sure you'll have many questions. Simply click the Q&A button in the side panel on the control panel and post your question. They will come to me. I've got them on a second screen here, so please do send them through, okay? In the meantime, if during the session you have experienced any technical difficulties, just again tell the team that are working behind the scenes that you've got an issue. Again, use the Q&A function for that and the team will pick it up. Upon completion of the session today, we would welcome your feedback. We really would. The only way we can improve and pick up subject matters that you want taken forward for the future is if you give us that feedback, so it's really important. BSI will send a link to the recording of the webinar in due course, so you can watch it again, you can share it with colleagues, etc. So please do make use of that. And as per normal, this is a CPD recognised webinar. Please request your certificate via the feedback survey, another reason to actually complete the feedback. And we'll get that to you as well. So that's it. Right, next slide, please. Let's get on with it. As I say, we have two great speakers joining us today in terms of Rachel Smalley and Amanda Sharma. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, as I keep saying, so please put them through. Next slide, please. So first up, we have Rachel, who will be exploring inclusive design approaches in relation to evacuation situations and the policy origin of evacuation lifts. I've known Rachel for quite some time. The position she now holds is Head of Inclusive Design at Jacobs. The Inclusive Design team at Jacobs takes a unique technical, engineering-based approach to deliver a built environment that works for the maximum range of people, informed by research, data, and evidence, delivering solutions that are relevant and future-proofed. Rachel is a chartered building engineer. In fact, she's a fellow of CABE, professional institution very close to my heart, a chartered town planner, and an NRAC registered access consultant. She is a leader in the industry in the field of inclusive design. She's worked as a special advisor to the House of Commons Women and Equality Select Committee and led the Access Association as national president for 7 years. It would also be remiss of me if I didn't mention all that she does for BSI and in effect the UK too, for her work as a committee expert and chair in the sphere of accessibility and inclusivity. So a big thank you from BSI for all that you continue to do. Rachel, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm going to start with addressing the question, what is inclusive design? It's one of the most quoted terms out there. It's probably one of the least defined terms as well. And I always like to start with a good scope question anyway. So what does inclusive design actually mean or result in? And our one-liner that we tend to use is inclusive design is about creating places for people. It's that simple, although it's not that simple. We kind of boil this down and approach inclusive design in terms of 5 elements. So on the screen at the moment, you can see what we describe as 5 elements of inclusive design. Firstly, we take a people-focused approach. That people-focused approach acknowledges difference in the way different people use the built environment. making sure we provide choice and meet the requirements of a diverse population. And I'll go into that in more detail on the next slide. Secondly, we always say it's really important that spaces are welcoming, promote participation, avoid segregation, and work seamlessly for people. They're places that people want to spend time in. That leads us on to the third element, which is usable. We aim to create places and spaces that can be entered, used, and exited, which we're going to focus on today, safely and with comfort and dignity for a diverse population. Fourthly, we always say inclusive design is about future-proofing the built environment. We design for and take into account change to create sustainable, adaptable places for not only current populations who we're designing for now, but also future populations and those demographic changes. And finally, relevant. We tailor solutions to social and cultural context using evidence, data and research to make places work for people. We also take a slightly different approach depending where in the world the scheme is as well. And that goes back to that flexibility as well. So there are the 5 elements of inclusive design. And one really important element of inclusive design is the who piece. So years ago, 15 years ago, I'd have been talking to you about access for disabled people. However, access for disabled people or accessibility is a very different discipline to inclusive design. So firstly, I'm going to go into age. In fact, you'll see on screen at the moment, there's anyone who's a fan of the Equality Act will recognise some of these as protected characteristics. Not all the protected characteristics, but we always say inclusive design takes into account protected characteristic groups or the requirements of protected characteristic groups where they are potentially impacted by design of the built environment. So firstly, age. We take into account a range of age groups, including older people, younger people, and children, because requirements can be very different between those groups. Disability, another difference between access for disabled people and an inclusive design approach is comes down to disability and the approach we take to disability. Traditionally, access for disabled people or accessibility has mainly focused on people with visible physical impairments. So most people, when we talk about disability, think of wheelchair users. I'll get onto that in a bit more detail in the next slide, but you can see from the list on the slide at the moment that this isn't actually a comprehensive list, but it's a far more comprehensive list than we would have been looking at in the past. So it's not just people with visible impairments, but there's a lot of hidden impairments and disabilities there as well. We also take into account requirements of people of all genders and also gender identities, people who are pregnant or have very, very young children, so that's come under a protected characteristic of pregnancy and maternity, and also people with a range of religious beliefs or no religious beliefs. Just on the point about wheelchair users, this slide, I'm not going to spend long on it, but this slide just highlights the range of requirements that exist in, this is taken from a Family Resources Survey a couple of years ago, to be honest, from Department for Work and Pensions. But just wanted to highlight this because we do tend to think of wheelchair users when we talk about disability, but only 4% of disabled people are actually wheelchair users. So this slide highlights the different impairment groups, different requirement groups, but also how the prevalence of these varies by age as well. So we also look at the intersectionality between different requirement groups and different protected characteristics. So on this slide, we're looking at disability and age as well. And you'll see certain impairments increase with age, and again, taking those into account when looking at evacuation and evacuation situations is super important. So you may be sat here thinking, why is Rachel talking to us about inclusive design? We're meant to be talking about fire. 2 points on that one. Firstly, egress is super important, and it's a super important element of creating a usable built environment. So going back to those elements of inclusive design. but also, as you'll see from the slide, the link is the London Plan. So a little bit of background on the London Plan, and those undertaking work in London will probably be familiar with the London Plan anyway. But the London Plan, which you're seeing on screen, was consulted on between the 1st of December 2017 and the 2nd of March 2018. So it's been kicking around even in draft form for quite a while now. It was considered by a formal examination in public, or EIP, which was led by independent inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State between January and May 2019. And then, after agreement from the Secretary of State, the current London Plan, which you're seeing on screen, was published in March 2021. So, London Plan Policy D5. I have to say I'm totally biased on this. This is my favourite planning policy ever, because it's D5 inclusive design. So I'm not actually going to talk to you about London Plan Policy D12 fire safety. I'm going to be focusing in on D5. So the actual policy is on screen at the moment, and the 2 points that I'm going to focus in on are B, 4 and 5. So requirement B4 states that people should be able to enter, use and exit a building safely, easily and with dignity. B5 goes into development proposals meeting the high standard of accessible inclusive design, and that they should be designed to incorporate safe and dignified emergency evacuation for all building users, and that in all developments where lifts are installed, a minimum of at least one lift per core, and yes, I did just mention cores, or potentially more subject to a capacity assessment, should be suitably sized fire evacuation lifts, which are suitable to be used to evacuate people who require level access from the building. So that's the actual policy requirement. That's not supporting text, that's not supplementary guidance, that's a policy requirement. However, having said that, there is some supporting supplementary guidance that accompanies the London Plan Policy D5. I'm definitely not going to read through this, but paragraph 3.5.10 is quite useful in that regard. You'll see in, that D5B5 mentions capacity assessments. So to add a little bit of context to that, I think it's worth looking into user demand for evacuation lifts, or user demand for people using lifts in an evacuation situation. Quick note on this one, props to Nick Mellor. He provided me with the stats and data on this one from a symposium paper he actually wrote last year. So thank you very much to Nick for this, and the source of the data is also in the corner of the slide. But I just wanted to point out, within this data, there is a percentage, or there was a percentage of participants, so participants in research, who would require the use of a lift regardless of the number of floors the lift was overcoming. So that's around 10%, a little bit more than 10% if we pull the stats out, is a really important percentage of the population who we should be designing for. So going back to that who piece at the beginning with inclusive design, many of those groups of people, for very different reasons, may require level access or the use of the lift in an evacuation situation. You'll see from the curve that we're looking at, this then increases the proportion of people who would want to use or require the use of the lift in an evacuation situation, increases with the number of floors. So next up, right at the other end of the curve, there are some people who would not use the lift regardless of the number of floors. Those people exist, so we also need to design for their requirements as well. And then towards the middle, I've just highlighted there's still significant demand, even where the number of floors is relatively low or fairly low. So around 50% of people would require the use of the lift, around 20 stories. And then Above that, most people would use a lift to evacuate, and yes, it goes up depending on the number of floors. So there's no big surprises there. But I just wanted to also highlight that we're not just talking about disabled people. So going back to the who piece at the beginning, and the fact we're probably thinking at the moment disabled people and wheelchair users, the kind of need for level access, or people who require level access in an emergency situation, is far greater than just disabled people, and not all disabled people would require level access. So, for example, protected characteristics of pregnancy and maternity, someone carrying a young child or a baby may be fine using the stairs for, I don't know, I'm guessing 20 floors maybe, but may not be fine using the stairs carrying a baby over 50 floors, for example. Or someone with a heart condition or a breathing condition may be fine using the stairs for 10 floors, but may not be fine using the stairs over 10 floors, 20 floors maybe. So there is evidence of significant demand for evacuation lifts. London Plan Policy D5 also mentions lift capacity assessments. The slide you're looking at the moment is just a very basic, shows a very basic image highlighting areas which need to be taken into account in terms of capacity assessments and the factors that should be informing the number, size and speed of evacuation lifts that are provided. So we're looking at evacuation time, we're looking at the evacuation strategy, we're looking at car loading factors, but also that user demand piece, which we looked at on the previous slide. I also wanted to just highlight fairly recent changes in office working practices or working practices, which are likely to have an impact on lifts being used in the situation. So we're seeing more flexible and less standardised working hours. To be honest, a lot of these changes are post-COVID. So people are working more flexibly, more people are working from home more of the time. Going on to the second bullet point there are probably fewer people who are office-based on a day-to-day basis. So there's a less predictable population within office buildings. There are also fewer office-based facilities management staff and reception staff as well. That all results in less cover, and that less cover means less cover of people to participate or assist in evacuation situations. So some solutions which may have been used in the past may no longer be suitable due to the lack of people to enable them. Some areas of offices may be completely unoccupied due to that flexible working approach. Second to the last bullet point there, I've also got changes in people's expectations over time. So focusing in on disabled people's expectations have changed a lot over the last 20 years. What may have been acceptable to an individual 20, 25 years ago may not be now. So that's another one to factor in. And just lastly, summing quite a few of those points up, but also assisted evacuation stair-based devices are not or may not be suitable for many people who require level access. So just some points to consider when looking at lift capacity assessments there. Nextly, slightly different subject, but still an important one, is adopting a more inclusive terminology. So a lot of fire safety professionals will use the term vulnerable persons, or potentially the acronym PRMs, persons of reduced mobility, to describe people who may require the use of a lift in an emergency situation. So I did a little exercise for this one and listed off groups of people who colleagues of mine would say fit under the label vulnerable persons. There's potentially quite a long list there. I'm not going to read through it all. I'm sure most of you recognise most of those descriptions. So I would question whether those terms are actually accurate or helpful. Looking at the list, it's really difficult from that list to ascertain whether people would require level access or would require the use of lift in an evacuation situation. So there's accuracy issues using that terminology, which mean that terminology is probably not helpful. There are some issues going back to people's expectations around whether some of those terms or some of those assumptions would now be classed as offensive. Some people would class some of those groupings as slightly offensive. I'd also question whether the vulnerable persons terminology, or PRMs, provide a comprehensive and accurate description of people, because potentially we don't know if level access is required. So going back to the who piece at the beginning, there are a few different protected characteristic groups who may require level access in an emergency, and very few of those are actually captured under our list of vulnerable persons descriptors. So I'm not the kind of person who says, oh, you can't say that without suggesting an alternative. So just to suggest some alternatives to that terminology in the name of accuracy, to be honest. So in terms of the who piece at the top, I'd suggest it's accurately stated who is being referred to or what their specific requirement is. So if someone requires level egress, why don't we just state that rather than saying vulnerable persons? Potentially, if you're looking for a catch-all term, a kind of more generic, general catch-all term, I'd suggest using building occupants with specific characteristics or people with specific requirements relating to fire safety. So again, that's less detailed, potentially less accurate, but often people are just looking for a catch-all term. I'd also suggest using more focused terms in terms of situation or requirements. So people with specific evacuation requirements, or it'd be really good if people got used to saying people who require level access. So looking back to the big who piece at the beginning, people under many of those protected characteristic groupings would or could require level egress or level access in an emergency. And why don't we just state that rather than trying to go for generic, more vague catch-all terms? Final slide before I hand over. What happens if we don't get this right? What are the risks of not providing evacuation lifts? So the image on the slide goes back to the key principles of inclusive design, which we introduced at the beginning. So firstly, risk is segregation. So you'll have seen the London Plan wording as well. The specific wording, avoiding segregation, is very deliberately in there because it's the approach of why should some people, due to their requirements or protected characteristics, be segregated out from other people? Why should people not be able to access a similar route or access the same services because of that difference? So we're aiming to avoid segregation, and from that also avoiding exclusion. Exclusion sounds like a very dramatic word to use, but potentially not providing evacuation lifts could result in people not being able to access workplaces, access employment or other services because there isn't a robust plan in place to get them out in an emergency. Lack of resilience and also unsuitable buildings which aren't future-proofed is a major concern. So potentially we could end up with buildings that can't be let or require significant upgrade works or replacement sooner because they don't contain a suitable means of escape for people who require level access. Companies are probably going to be less likely to take on those buildings, knowing their duties and obligations under equality-based legislation. So potentially we could end up with building stock which isn't usable, which takes us on to our last bullet point there. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to hand across to Amal now.
Thank you, Rachel. You're actually handing across to me. Rachel, excellent as always, and hugely insightful, so thank you. I've got quite a few questions for you, but we'll save those up for the end if we may. Thank you, Rachel. Right, next up we have Aman Sharma, who will be considering evacuation lift design and operation in unmanaged residential situations. Again, some questions on this already. Most timely as well, I would suggest, given a few recent announcements of late. Aman served as Deputy Chair of the Building Regulation Advisory Committee, known as BRAC, from 2019 to 2023. A statutory advisory committee advising the Secretary of State, Michael Gove at the time, in England on building regulation and safety matters. He continues to chair the government's technical review of approved document B. That was a BRAC working party. That is now a BAC working party. That's the Building Advisory Committee that's been set up under the new building safety approach and is there definitively to advise the building safety regulator on operational issues, including building regulations, guidance as such. And the man is also a main member of the main BAC committee itself. If that's not all enough, he's chair of BSI committees FSB 111 and FSH 1411, leading on the development of a new British standard for the development and use of fire strategies. And again, similar to Rachel, for which myself and BSI are extremely grateful for all that he gives in terms of his time there. And again, if that's not enough, his actual day job is CEO of Totus Digital, a fire engineering consultancy specialising in fire engineering innovation and digital information management. Aman, great to have you back. Over to you.
Thank you, Ant, and thank you, Rachel, as well. It is very, very good to be back supporting the BSI IFE collaboration, and a warm welcome to everyone who's joined us this afternoon. I'm going to probably do something that sounds a little bit counterintuitive and possibly just start with what we're not intending to cover in this smaller part of today's webinar. And what we're not going to do is a compare and contrast with different types of lifts and looking at specific design parameters of those systems that can be provided that deliver a holistic solution for firefighting facilities in the round, or indeed evacuation facilities in the round as well. I'd like to focus on the very nuanced and challenging piece of unmanaged residential settings, and that's as an evolutionary piece from Rachel's very good presentation there, diving deep into the policy origin and pulling out the why of some of the challenges that we are experiencing today, and potentially some of the blockers that we've created for ourselves as an industry without looking at this pragmatically and with that innovation mindset to tackle some of those solutions. But we'll start with a little bit of an overview on why we are where we are today, and indeed what the purpose of evacuation lifts in the round are for. Rachel very helpfully and poignantly reminds us of the correct terminology to use, and as you can see in the first point, you know, we design evacuation lifts, we provide them to enable persons who require level access to self-evacuate, going back to that dignity piece, which is a very, very important element to consider here, for those individuals to evacuate to a place of safety wherever they are in a building. And if we think about, again, the very specific nuances between managed and unmanaged settings, we are, I'm sure, acutely aware of the separate challenges that arise when we consider those specific scenarios. We also know that evacuation lifts should be available to use during an evacuation scenario when the building has entered into an emergency evacuation phase, and that some high-level features that we associate with evacuation lifts include additional precautions for water and fire resistance and independent backup power supplies. Where do we turn to for this guidance? Well, as we move on to the next slide, typically we move to access BS 9999 and specifically Annex G and BS 9991, and amongst other sections and annexes, 8.4 of 9991 begins to discuss those requirements in the unmanaged residential scenario in particular. The SEN 8176 is a very interesting discussion in of its own right. I suspect there's probably a broader conversation to have around that, which we might expand upon in the Q&A section, so I won't labour that point here, but we do know that, of course, that the 8.1 series, the BSEN 8.1 series, does provide us with predominantly rules for the construction and installation of this, rather than the management procedures that would normally be incorporated into the 999 series, in particular the 2 standards that we see before us. However, the main purpose I want of this slide, and the main takeaway I would like all to consider, is the role that guidance should actually be playing in this space. This is a reminder, more than anything else, of our need as fire engineers and fire safety consultants, and indeed all the other disciplines joining us today, that it is the functional requirements of the building regulations that should be the primary focus of setting and achieving our fire safety objectives through our fire strategies, not what is perceived as prescriptive guidance at times that is set out within these 2 documents in particular, notwithstanding the interconnectivity between 9999 and 9991. Of course, you know, the elephant in the room is that 9991 is undergoing a significant review, and we hope to see the outputs of that review and update very, very soon, I'm sure. However, we do know, and users of these documents, and I hope there are many on the call who are familiar with this approach, that the 2 standards refer to each other, particularly in this space, and pass the reader between the 2 documents to set out some concepts and principles for application in the development of fire strategies. However, it doesn't quite unpack the complexities of delivering an evacuation lift in an unmanaged residential setting. So what should we actually do about this? Well, what has been done, as we move on to the next slide, is probably, I would suggest, a very poor example of the cultural reform we're hoping to see, particularly since the onset of policy D5 and in particular part B5 of D5 of the London Plan, but also as we consider the evolution of approved document B, volume 1 and 2, respectively, but in particular volume 1 for the all-important unmanaged piece. And let me just reiterate, this is not the world according to any one individual, but this is feedback from our colleagues in the regulatory world, the enforcement world, the authorities, etc., etc., and equally fire engineers who participate on government technical working groups as well. We have seen a deference of that design responsibility being kicked into the occupation phase. Now, what I mean by that specifically is that we have seen a number of fire strategies be presented where the challenge of delivering an evacuation strategy that incorporates the use of an evacuation lift where there is no on-site competent person to manage that evacuation, as per the guidance in 9991 and 9999, be kicked into the long grass with de facto lines such as a suitable evacuation strategy should be developed once the building is occupied. I think beyond other things, it just demonstrates an unwillingness to think proactively about what those operational solutions should look like when providing this all-important active measure in an unmanaged residential scenario. And I'd like to just loop back, I think, to at least 2 of those 5 inclusive design principles that Rachel shared with us here. And those 2 are the people-focused element and also the future-proofing piece as well, which brings me to that penultimate point, that all of the above and everything else that we've seen as a thematic feedback loop back into the Building Advisory Committee, but also into the Building Regulations Advisory Committee as well, once when it was still in play, was that there was a lack of focus on for exactly who we were designing our buildings for. And I think Dame Judith reminds us of that more than any other person across the industry at the moment, that the focus should be absolutely on the end user, and of course the end user being an unmanaged residential setting, residents. So it's equally important that we remember that people-focused element, but also the ability to future-proof our buildings such to accommodate the new learning that we're going through, which may or may not mean the introduction of new active systems or passive systems as well, but also the implementation of operational procedures to help make use of those systems as they evolve in their thinking. And this is one of my favourite quotes that I think I'm pretty sure my very good friend and colleague Rachel will recognise from our days working together on this many years ago. that I still carry with me today, and that is that there isn't any guidance telling me how to design for evacuation lifts in unmanaged residential settings. My response, I think, at the time was, well, should that stop you from trying? And I think that moves on to the next point, because it's not all doom and gloom, because we have seen some pragmatic solutions coming forward in this area, and I'm really encouraged to see that as well, not least through, I'm very proud of my own bioengineering teams leading the way on this, but equally we've seen the global multidisciplinaries respond, Jacob's included in that, respond to this with vigour and without fear or favour, and are challenging the baseline approach that we've seen, the industry standard approach that we see through guidance, which is a good thing, and we'll come back to why that's a very good thing to do, and it may be considered as concessions or derogations against the minimum best practice, but that's how we develop British standards, that's how we develop European standards, and so on and so forth. And some of those pragmatic solutions have looked a little bit like this, and we've seen a great deal of consultation and engagement with appropriate bodies on those methods to deploy the evacuation strategy. So certainly on schemes that I know a number of teams have been working on, which we are either directly or indirectly connected to. Some of the feedback that comes back into me as chair of Approved Document B's technical review, the government's technical review, has been that earlier engagement with the authorities, in particular the AHJs concerning with fire safety engineering, has helped to develop a consensus on how to deploy the evacuation strategy in an unmanaged residential setting where an evacuation lift or evacuation lifts have been provided. And not just for evacuation and not just for evacuation lifts. Clearly, that brings about benefits and advantages in a number of other areas concerning the development of a fire strategy. I'm sure there will be those on their call wanting to remind me that actually getting in front of the AHJ is a challenge enough in and of itself. But certainly, I think with the onset of the new regime, at the very least, for higher risk buildings, you'll find that you will be you won't have a choice but to be engaging with those bodies. So there is an opportunity to make use of that, at the very least, for HRBs. Certainly a pragmatic and a proactive design narrative that is supporting specific scenarios to assets, much in line with what we've been hearing about the use of high hazard approaches such as safety case principles in HRBs, and being very specific in fire strategy development about selection of design fires that help build out a narrative to justify why an evacuation strategy is appropriate in an unmanaged residential scenario. And on the final slide, when we come to it, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that I refer to as the stay put paradox, but I'll come to that a little bit later, which links back to this idea of using asset-specific design plans and scenarios. We're also seeing a great deal more computational analyses, which demonstrate tenability to help support the delivery of an evacuation strategy in an unmanaged residential scenario. So that's the use of both a combination, I would suggest, of quantitative and qualitative data to demonstrate a body of evidence, produce and demonstrate a body of evidence that ultimately, remembering what we're actually trying to achieve, and that is create an evidence base to demonstrate compliance to the relevant part of Schedule 1 of the building regulations. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, the interface between the cause and effect of the active and passive systems necessary to deliver an evacuation strategy. So this is getting into the detail, this is getting into the semantics of what it is you want that building to do when it needs to do it to enable those who require level access to get out safely and with dignity. And there are I would suggest a handful of examples that we can use there. And again, this does link back to the design fire context here. And we'll touch and we'll expand a little bit more upon it within the stay put conversation, because I think we need to have that conversation in the context of this. But fundamentally, this is about challenging the norm, as it were, and thinking very, very, very closely and in a very nuanced way about how you want that cause and effect to enable the delivery of both your evacuation strategy, but also the behaviour of your passive systems and your active systems. What do you want the mechanical ventilation system to do? What perhaps do you provide on top of the minimum provisions for compartmentation to enable someone to safely escape and take refuge from outside a dwelling fire, etc., and contextualising all of that in and around some credible design fire scenarios. We'll move on to what is, I think, the final slide, if I may, because we'll expand on a couple of those points, just to summarise and pass back for what I think is, by the sounds of it anyway, Ant, is a bank of questions that have come in on this. I think we all need to remind ourselves that we are taking collective responsibility at the earliest design phases as possible. We're seeing the onset of a new building control regime for higher risk buildings, which is forcing us to do that, and I think that's the right thing to do. Certainly in the amendments to planning law, which I think someone on the call may have had a hand in, has also equally forced us to do that as well. And again, it allows us to have these discussions in detail a lot earlier, such that we can gain that consensus and have some confidence and assurance that the fire strategy objectives that we are setting ourselves are achievable, deliverable, and proportionate as well, of course. Now, this idea of a stay put paradox is something that I just ask people to reflect on here, because it's a reminder that we as advisors to the government, and the government haven't suggested that stay put is something that will be for the bin anytime soon, and with its principles still deeply embedded in CP3, of course. Again, there's probably another separate, much more informed conversation around this. It's something to bear in mind when we talk about evacuation of unmanaged residential buildings, because as we build out our fire and emergency files, which will connect in with our fire strategies, as we build out our safety cases and safety case reports for higher risk buildings, we as an industry will become more accustomed to developing more of the qualitative evidence base that is directly referenced to the quantitative evidence base. So that is essentially me saying that we need to be very clear and very prescriptive about detail that suggests how that building is, or why that building is still safe to occupy, and what maintenance procedures have been put in place to maintain that level of building safety, whatever that level actually is. So think about that in context of the evacuation strategy now. And for those who have incorrectly, I would suggest, purported that providing evacuation lifts will encourage a chaotic mass evacuation of unmanaged residential buildings, such that lifts will be bouncing from floor to floor, and lobbies will be blocked, and stairs will be representative of crash zones, etc., etc. I'm afraid I just don't recognise that challenge, because I'm not entirely sure which buildings that don't have communal AFD would be able to alert residents in unmanaged residential settings to actually transpire that scenario in the first instance. So if we make those assumptions at design, if we're talking about these buildings that we are still engineering and designing to allow people to stay put in unmanaged residential scenarios, then through the application of a detailed design narrative using appropriate design fires, we can begin to think about the behaviour of our passive and active systems, such that, for example, we might just let our evacuation lifts run, so that someone requiring level access can call the lift and exit that building in a safe and dignified way, because they probably will be evacuating, depending on the design fire scenario you've chosen, because there's a dwelling fire, and it's their dwelling fire that they're shutting the door behind on. So whereas the risk to the individual once they are in a protected core, and obviously in a protected lift well as well, something to think about. Ultimately, to implement a system solution. Now, this is something that follows the Building Safety Act and the supporting secondary legislation will be deeply familiar with. It's a systems approach to thinking about building safety, and we're not talking about just fire here, but we're talking about all of the other disciplines as well. So, you know, what structural elements we're seeing Part A3 of Schedule 1 of the building regulations come into thinking of some of our higher engineering deliverables, and that's an encouragement from our new building safety regulator to think about building safety in the round, and not just in our usual silos. I think that can help the evacuation lift conversation as well. But also, as I draw back to that final point before I hand back to you, and it's a reminder of what the overall priority is here, and certainly what I think what Dame Judith might want me to reinforce as my final point, and that's to remember who we are providing these systems for, and actually who has the most to gain and equally the most to lose by us as designers and us as fire engineers either getting this right or getting it wrong. So I will stop there, Ant, if I may, and I think hopefully I've left enough time for a good Q&A session. So very much look forward to this questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman. Brilliant as always, and extremely thought-provoking. If, Aman, Rachel, you're happy to turn your cameras on and join me for this panel final session. We do have lots of questions, lots. So let's get started on those. I suggest I'll try and take some quite broad, overarching questions, and then there are some quite sort of fundamentally deep but quick technical ones, which I'd be quite keen to get through a few of those as well, if time allows. Right then, first one up, and it focuses in on really make it part of your presentation, Aman, today, but I think it's worth asking so you allow you to labour the point. You've been asked, what statutory guidance is available on evacuation lists, or is following BS 7974, Fire Safety Engineering, the only method that can aid compliance? Aman, did you want to?
Yes, I do.
Front that one.
So, shall we talk about statutory guidance and guidance? I do think this term is something that gets a little bit confused still. Now, when we talk about statutory guidance, we are talking about in the context of this conversation today, the approved document. So I've mentioned approved document B, and of course there are some others as well, which we won't get into now. But they are statutory in nature, simply because the Secretary of State has a duty to provide guidance in that space. There is a statutory requirement for him or her at the time to produce guidance in that area. And I don't need to labour this point on the BSI call, I hope, to this audience, but of course our British standards are not, although they are referenced, we would refer to them as being normatively referenced in our standard speaking world, within those ADs, absolutely throughout, because there is a recognition, I'm sure, that as our national standards body, that this is inappropriate to develop consensus, and that's why an important distinction between what is statutory and what is not statutory makes a really, makes a lot of sense just to recover here. To the main part of the question as to what statutory guidance exists for evacuation lifts. Evacuation lift design is discussed within ADP. It is discussed, but it crucially isn't discussed in terms of the operational element of unmanaged residential. We are addressing that, we are looking at that, and we will have answers for that in due course. I'm not at liberty to disclose timelines for obvious reasons, but it is part of the wider technical review conversation. However, a key reminder here, and I think the same applies to British Standard Development and Review, is the point I was trying to hopefully make and did make quite clearly in my part there, and that is that I would encourage everyone on the call just to remind themselves of where good practice actually ends up. So one of the first things that we do when we develop either new British standards or review existing British standards is we look to the industry. We look to these things and we look to what's happening out there. We speak to the Jacobs of the world, the Arabs and the Atkins and so on and so forth, and we go right down the supply chain and we try and get as much evidence as possible to actually determine what that baseline is. What does good actually look like here? And do we need to bring some of that thinking in to normalise within a new standard, or as I say, an upgrade to an existing standard? And that's why it's important to drive that innovation, irrespective of what policies may or may not be in play at the time. We just so happen to have a regional policy in London plan that is, at the time, it certainly was aspirational. I think we've gone past that point now where it's deliverable, because I've seen it being delivered, and so will many others on the call. And we are in a position to learn and glean from that innovation now to start cascading into new standards. But in a future iteration of ADP Volume 1 and Volume 2, you will certainly see design guidance for evacuation, particularly in unmanaged scenarios.
Thank you, man. Rachel, any thoughts you'd wish to offer? Be mindful that you've been a regulator both in the London Mayor's office and nationally as well, and now where you sit within Jacobs. Any thoughts? I think you might be on mute, Rachel.
Thank you. I'd just like to remind people of the intent behind London Plan Policy and most requirements, and the fact that D5B5 is in the inclusive design policy as opposed to fire safety. I think it's really important to make those links between the two. To be very honest, practically it's in the inclusive design policy because the requirements around evacuation list were actually drafted pre-Grenfell. So on a very practical level, that's why it's an inclusive design, but it's also an inclusive design because if we are getting a diverse population into buildings, we also need to be able to get them out safely as well. And I think that's an area that regulators could do with looking into going forwards.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. Moving on from that, I can't not mention this, can I, given the questions come in? It was on my mind as well. Given the recent ministerial statement about the future provision in approved document B in England of 2 stairs above 18 metres in residential buildings, what might this provision mean in terms of future lift provisions in such buildings? Who wants to go that one first?
No, I think I better take that one, hadn't I? So the and you'll appreciate I'm bound by our terms of references, disclosing what I can't disclose in my position as chair. What I will say, what I absolutely will say, is that in my personal opinion, we cannot answer the second stair piece in the round until we bottom out the evacuation lift piece, and specifically the evacuation lift piece in unmanaged residential. Now, I'm clear that industry has helped and is continuing to help to inform what those solutions look like. We have as you know, we have a mechanism in place to facilitate that. We have a loose plan in place to build upon to provide that information. And as I said earlier on, we will see future multiple updates to ADB, as we have done over the last few years, and I've been chair of that particular work stream since 2019, as you know. And in that time, we've seen at least 6 updates to the approved document B, and we'll see several more. And in a series of those updates, we will see the outputs of that work that will eventually incorporate recommendations and configuration of a second stair, which will also include design options for evacuation lifts, which will ultimately inform the operational procedures, because this is a holistic piece. We know from the WMS, the ministerial statement that was made last week to the upper house, that there is a significant transitional phase for second stairs. So one would argue that we have a little bit of bandwidth to think about this, but I wouldn't want us to stymie that innovation. And I don't think it's innovation in the literal sense of the word. I just think I use the word pragmatic very purposefully. It's thinking outside the box, and those the sort of, you know, line following standards, or lines within standard, if you like, to say, well, this section here doesn't allow me to do this. To think more functionally about how they can make that argument in a credible way, such that they can demonstrate that compliance piece to the relevant parts of the building regulations too. So the key point there really is that second stairs, evacuation lifts, I think, are a homogenous piece, and we are encouraging our colleagues and our officials to think about them iteratively, and the focus is very much on evacuation lifts for the time being.
Absolutely, thank you. And look, we know how hard civil servants regulators are working on this at the moment, and you know, we'll soon enough see where the considerations finally land. Rachel, did you have any thoughts on this one in particular?
I'd probably just give a very more immediate and London-based answer, I'm afraid. As in, London Plan Policy wording was very specific in this regard, as in it's a minimum of at least 1 lift per core. That wording was very deliberately picked and is now quite relevant. We do inclusive design, and you could say that was kind of future-proofing this policy a little bit.
Absolutely. If you allow me, it follows up a question that has come in, which is a technical one, but the question was, what do you mean by a core? Do you mean a lift core, or do you mean a stair core?
Oh, interesting question.
I think so.
And in terms of interpretation of the London plan, because I don't actually work for the mayor anymore, I don't feel I can answer that one, to be very honest.
No.
But yeah, it's a really interesting question.
No, absolutely. But if you have any more thoughts later, or Aman does, we'll come back. Right, circling around, I mean, again, this is notwithstanding, yeah, statutory guidance, hugely important, one way of showing compliance, but as we've heard from Rachel as well, think about people's needs, especially if you know who's in the building where you have that. Quite hard in residential, but where you know, think about what might be the right thing to do and take a client with you on that journey as well. But a further question we've got here is that evac lifts are regularly omitted from schemes due to unfavourable value engineering. How do the panel see the cost benefit changing due to new technologies? Rachel, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and yeah, sometimes we do see this. For me, I do inclusive design. I'd go back to, do we want this building to be usable and future-proofed? And approach it from that angle, as in, we want this building to create a welcoming space that people feel they can use. In terms of that last slide of mine and potential consequences and risks associated with not providing evacuation lifts, potentially people could be excluded from, I'm going for a workplace example, from the workplace, and companies may choose not to locate in those buildings going forwards. So that, I'd say, if there is a financial argument there, a financial counter argument and rebuttal there.
Thank you. Right, I won't offer that to Aman because we can get a few more questions in if we may. This question comes up a lot. Can firefighters' lifts be combined with evacuation lifts? Aman, I'll go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, this does come up a lot, and you're absolutely right. And as I said at the top of the section, what we weren't doing was a compare and contrast in terms of, you know, the features and design parameters between the different types of this. But of course, there are others as well. We know that there is some guidance out there that does suggest that you can use even passenger lifts actually to facilitate the evacuation of those requiring level access, albeit with counter recommendations and nuances associated with it. The answer I think I would give is yes, if it can be reasonably justified in any scenario. Okay, so this comes back to the functional piece, and obviously with the former fire and rescue service hat on as well. The only sort of reminder that I would make to design teams, inclusive of fire engineers, is that there is a fundamental line as to when an evacuation has started, stopped, and rescue has begun. And that matters significantly in terms of the arguments being made within fire strategies and design documentation as to why a firefighter lift might double up as an evacuation lift at a point in time. Because if you are providing systems for the sole purpose and the sole use by FRS, then I'm sure our AHJs might have something to say about that during QDR processes and so on and so forth. So this comes back to that functional approach. This comes back to that sort of, you know, that broader thinking, that the consensus that is being developed amongst the design team about what systems are in place to enable the execution of an evacuation strategy that has been focused specifically upon those occupancy profiles. That was inherently, you know, at the heart of what was being thought about pre-Grenfell, as Rachel reminded us. You know, so the P5 piece was not a reactionary piece to Grenfell. The thinking was being done beforehand, and actually is what it's informing policy thinking now as well. It's that resident-centric, in the case of unmanaged resi, but occupancy-centric approach. And if that's a combination of existing and new systems, then that's fine, so long as that open space is there to demonstrate compliance to the all-important regulations.
That's great, thank you. We've got 1 minute left and I'm going to try and finish on time. Rachel, did you have any thoughts on even a yes/no answer? Can you use firefighters' lifts combined as evacuation lifts?
I'll pass on that one, it'll be quicker.
No, okay, look, great, thank you ever so much. And look, from my perspective, thank you thank you to our speakers. I think you've been brilliant today. We've got a lot more questions, we really do, and we'll see how we can best answer those and feed them back via the IFE route. So please do leave that with us. Listen, I hope you agree it's been a really insightful session today. There is clearly a lot more to happen in the field of evacuation lifts, both from a standards perspective and from a regulatory perspective, I suggest. We've had a couple of questions about when is BSI 8176 coming and the revised 991. We'll be looking for those typically to be next year, but don't hold me to those. So that's it. So all that leaves me to do is to say a huge thank you again to our speakers. They've been great. A huge thank you to yourselves for taking time out of your busy diary to join us today. And a massive thank you to the IFE team and the BSI events team for making this all happen. And again, we'd love to see you again. You'll get this slide anyway, but we've got a couple of events coming up in the coming months. It would be great to see you there. Thanks for now and see you soon. Bye.